Joel Mokyr has this year been awarded the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences, endowed by the Central Bank of Sweden, for having identified the conditions for sustained growth through technological development. In this 2010 interview, Mokyr reflects on the course of economic progress from the dawn of capitalism in the 17th century to the modern age.
Well, people probably would differ exactly when the first time when capitalism emerged. It isn't like Christianity or Islam, in which it's sort of somebody once they say, oh, let's start this, and then he had disciples, and the disciples had more disciples, and eventually it moved. Capitalism wasn't like that at all. It involves certain elements that aren't shared by everybody, but essentially it means the commercialization of economic relations, both in the markets for goods and services and in the markets for capital, labor and land. But I don't think that's enough. You need some system of property rights that backs it up. And that seems to be in place, say, in the beginning of the 17th century, although its grip is far from unshakable at that time. What happens is that early capitalism gets captured often by special interest, monopolies in particular, organizations of workers like guilds, who try to actually subvert the free market in their own favor, sometimes more successfully, sometimes less successfully. But it's clear that in the middle of the 18th century, thereabout, first in Britain and then in other countries, what happens is what we call the Industrial Revolution. And at that point, capitalism becomes less about commerce and finance and more about what Schumpeter called creative destruction. It becomes increasingly technology-directed. Creative destruction basically is the introduction of new technology that wipes out whatever was there before, okay? So by introducing mechanical weaving, this is in the 1810s and 1820s, basically made hundreds of thousands of handlooms in Britain museum pieces, and the people who knew how to skill them either had to learn new skills or else basically they were out of luck. Now, what happened was true for handloom weavers was true for literally scores and scores of artisans and handicraft workers whose skills eventually became unnecessary because they were being replaced by machines. So some of these people in the end found jobs in the factories, others migrated to America, still others eventually became part of some unemployed proletariat and fell back on the poor rate. Clearly there was a cost there. Then there is slowly a dawning of a sense that this system needs to be amended. A very early beginning of an interventionist state, which makes sure that not only that children go to school and that we have a military, but that lots of social provisions are being taken care of. Of course, a pioneer in the matter in the Bismarck reforms of the 1880s, but it's true even in the Netherlands and in Scandinavian countries. But the recognition that capitalism cannot really be allowed to rely entirely on free markets is there already from John Stuart Mill onward. And it's just a question of how should we do it? Some people want to have liberal reforms, others want to have socialism. And of course in Russia it's the first time in which instead of reforming capitalism, they throw it out of the window. And they try a different system. One of the problem is it's not compatible with that of the rest of the world. And so what happens in the interwar period is that capitalism comes under a terrible shock. Clearly, the great collapse of 1929 was an inherent criticism of capitalism. And lots of people, asked the question, can capitalism survive? And the answer was no. Also, their reasons were different. Schumpeter basically thought, capitalism wouldn't survive because it would be taken over by bureaucrats. Other people felt that capitalism couldn't survive because it would never have enough employment and aggregate demand to make sure that people were fully employed. Against those rose a group of Keynesians who basically said, look, capitalism can survive. The only thing we need a slightly updated version in which the government doesn't just make sure that children go to school and that people don't die in mining accidents and so on. We also need a government that makes sure that capitalism will guarantee full employment. And that's easy to do because we can play with government budget and we can play with the money supply. And so a combination of fiscal and monetary policy should keep the capitalism alive and well. Though Roosevelt was not a Keynesian. He maintained balanced budgets, but the notion that the government would have to run fiscal deficits to keep the population employed really only came through in the post-World War II years. The 30 years after World War II, as everybody knows, were years of immense economic growth and success. Living standards increased prodigiously everywhere in the West. The French refer to it as les 30 glorieuses, the 30 glorious years. And in Germany, this is the Wirtschaftswunder, you know, the economic miracle. These were years of extreme success in which a coalition between government, private enterprise, and don't forget labor unions were able to create this covenant in which everybody would benefit from economic growth and from the government making sure there's a big safety net. And this seems to, and certainly by 1970, nobody thought there was a cloud in the sky and that this version of capitalism would work forever. But economic growth slowed down in the 1970s from 4 to 5% a year to under 2%, and that hurt. Unemployment went up, whether this was the oil shock or some other things, people were still not in full agreement with it. But clearly the system was seen to be increasingly inefficient. Too many people were getting a free ride, too many people were taking advantage of the system, and so there was a general sense the pendulum needed to swing back in the other direction. We needed to re-privatize, we needed to reduce government intervention, cut government budgets, cut taxation, and in some sense, you know, this has become associated with the Thatcher-Reagan revolution in the UK and in Britain, but in fact similar things were happening all over the continent, including here in Sweden, in which things were being re-privatized. And we felt that, you know, the supervision by government on capitalism had gone too far, and it needed to be reined in somewhat. Now, nobody was proposing to go back to the bad old days of the 19th century, but I think there was some sense of government had gone too far and the welfare state had exploded. And this isn't just a Republican issue in the United States, because in fact the biggest reforms to the welfare system were introduced by Bill Clinton. There is a clear sentiment that we want the government to regulate certain sectors of the economy, above all, of course, the financial sector, which clearly has, by all accounts, somehow gotten out of hand and needs re-regulation. Alan Greenspan, the former, you know, chair of the board of chair of the Federal Reserve, has basically admitted that he went too far in believing in markets and that some measure of regulation is necessary. This is sort of the dynamic of this, okay? It works well for a few decades, then it hits a crisis and it sort of scratches its head and wise people sit down and say, well, we need to reform the system. We shouldn't be in the illusion that this is smooth and clean. Not at all. Lots of mistakes are being made. But eventually, you know, they get it right, more or less. We never have a perfect world. We just have a world that's well enough. That's the secret of capitalism. It can reinvent itself and come up with new solutions. And so far, that's worked for 300 years.